Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Endgame class. Tonight I am going to be showing you some endgames rather, from the Norway Chess tournament currently going on, you guessed it, in Norway. Of course, this is the same tournament from the Road to 2000 lecture tonight, and unfortunately for Aryan Tari, we are going to continue looking at his games because he loses in really interesting ways. And that is a compliment, believe it or not, but he played a very interesting game against Fabiano Caruana that I want to start with here tonight. So let's jump into it. Of course, Aryan starts with the move e4, but we don't care. This is not the end game. This is some sort of opening, some kind of Sicilian. Pieces are being traded. Oh my gosh. Maybe if some more pieces get traded, I can start to think about the game. And yeah, this is where I am going to claim we can officially start talking about the position. So what is going on in this position? I'm calling this the start of the end game, even though there are still 3 pieces on the board. Black's king is very much participating in the position, and 2 rooks and a minor piece against 2 rooks and a minor piece, I think is safe to call some kind of end game. So what's going on here? Who do we think should be better? Well, let's try and break down the position a bit. I sort of spoiled the next move already, but of course in the position, Black has some pressure down the C file, and White's main benefit in the position is going to be this D pawn. This is White's big boon here, right? If White can push this pawn one more step down the board, this bishop is going to be activated, and the pawn is going to have some very serious threats of becoming a queen. And that's how we arrive at Fabi's next move, knight c4. Not being tempted with capturing some pawn on a4. Of course, this would allow the move d6, and then, this king has to go somewhere, and White is very much winning the game after something like bishop takes b7. So, knight c4, an important idea for Fabi. We see rook e2, and then knight d6. And this is the defensive setup that Fabi has against this pawn on d5. So let's try and think deep, deep, deep into the future and talk about what's going to happen in this game. Well, first and foremost, Aryan starts with e4, and now let's put ourselves in Fabi's shoes and think about how we can try to ever win the game, and first and foremost, how can we improve our position? So the main imbalance of the position is number 1, the pawn structure, and number 2, this bishop against this knight. So task number 1 for Fabi is going to be trying to make sure that the knight is more powerful than the bishop in this case. So how does Fabi do that? Well, he starts with the move a5, which is a very, very sensible move. Aryan Tari plays a slightly strange looking move, rook to a1 here. And with this move, we should have some idea of what White is thinking about. So, what do you think White's idea is with rook a1? And then also, down the road, how can Black ever try to improve his position? These are the questions I'm going to ask you right off the bat, chat room. See what you can find. How can Black try to win the game later on down the road? I'm not saying immediately, but I'm saying what ideas does Black have to sort of change the position? These are important things to think about, right? Not because you're going to play these ideas immediately, but because these, they give you a good sense of a general goal to work towards in the game. So we're not talking about, a specific line just yet. We're talking about ways to, shake up the position down the road. So Simon has a great idea, right? For Black, potentially this idea of f5 is going to be a very important break to keep in mind. f5 would shake loose the defender of the d5 pawn. It would also give this king a path into the game, right? From f6 into f5 later on, if White were to capture. Of course, if White doesn't capture, Black is going to consider breaking down this pawn on e4. Right, so f5 is a really important move to keep in mind for both sides in the game, right? Both Aryan and Fabi are going to be thinking about this move as time goes by. Fabi looking for ways to make it good, and Aryan looking for ways to make sure it never happens, or if it does happen, he is well prepared to meet it. In the meantime, does white have any similar ideas that black should be keeping in mind? Right? Especially with the move rook a1. Especially with the move rook a1. What do we think white's evil intentions are after we see the move rook a1 appear on the board? Some people in the chat are saying rook a3, rook b3, and I definitely don't think this is the idea. He could have done this idea over here instead of coming to a1. And yeah, Chess King mentions a really nice idea, which is c3 and b4, right? Black has this one pawn break over here, perhaps, but white has his own ideas as well, trying to break through, make use of this a pawn on a4, and push his pawn majority on this half of the board. So definitely, that is something to look out for. So what does Fabi do? Well, first and foremost, he makes sure that this c3, b4 idea is just not going to happen, right? He makes sure he prevents this. So how can we prevent this? Now let's get to specific moves, right? We have a general idea of what's going on in the position. We know that black is potentially thinking about playing these moves, g6, f5 at some point. And we know that white, after rook a1 especially, is considering these ideas of c3 and b4. Right? So we have a good feeling for what is going on, what players are playing for. Now, how do we turn that into actual moves? How do we turn it into actual moves? For black. I'll get rid of some of these arrows for you. And yeah, you guys are right. A lot of people in the chat said this move before we finished talking about the ideas, because it is just naturally attractive to play rook c4, pressuring both of these pawns as well as the c pawn. But the really critical idea is after the move c3, Fabi plays the improving move f6, and now white tries rook e3 to try and get this b4 idea a little bit closer to reality, maybe b3, kicking the rook, and then b4. And to make sure this never happens for white, Fabi plays the move rook hc8. So this move rook c4 wasn't just some sort of one-move threat, some simple improving move to attack the pawns. It was with the idea of doubling on the c-file, not so much to pressure the c-pawn, but to use the pressure against the c-pawn to stop white's big breakthrough idea of b3, b4 in the position. So very purposeful moves by Fabi. Don't be deceived by how, natural improving they look. They are very, very purposeful and very focused, right? And that's what a lot of these endgames require here. You can't go around playing, just nonchalant moves that you think improve your pieces. You have to be aware of the ideas behind them. And that's why I wanted to stop at that earlier position and talk to you guys about what was actually going on in the endgame. White plays the move king f2 here, just to try and improve. And now Fabi goes for a pretty interesting idea. So we talked about the plan of playing f5. Are there any other plans in the position for black that we neglected to mention? Any other plans for black to consider here? So Thaddeus says the move b6. Now b6 is one of those moves that may technically improve black's position by, defending this guy over here, but I don't think this is really along the right track, right? It's sort of a nothing move, right? And black can make very purposeful moves still with the time that he has. And yeah, the chat is arriving at the right idea here, but maybe not quite for the right reasons. And that move is g5. And the chat is saying g5 to create a passer, because of course white will take, black will take, and then, the h-pawn is becoming passed. And I think this is a good idea for black. This is what was actually played in the game. But of course, white is not actually forced to capture on g5, and you have to account for this scenario. And in fact, Aryan Tari does not capture on g5 in the game. Instead, Aryan playing the move bishop f3 to challenge the h5 pawn, but then Fabi, of course, responds with the move g4. And this is the real idea behind g5. not because Fabi wanted this passer on the king side, but to get this move g4. And this may be very counterintuitive to people at first glance. Of course, in these endgames, we are always told to put our pawns on the color opposite the bishop, but rarely is life that clean. The endgames you end up in are quite often much messier than that, where it's very difficult to get all of your pawns on the squares opposite the bishop, and I think Fabi has an even better scenario now. So, if you examine this position, Black has a very distinct weakness on the h5 square, a weakness that can be attacked with moves like bishop f3, or eventually, the bishop rerouting somewhere along this diagonal. This pawn can be attacked very definitively. So by playing g5, g4, now Fabi has improved his position so that this pawn can only be attacked from this diagonal, and this is not a very realistic diagonal for the white bishop to land on. In addition to that, he is very seriously hampering the white squared bishop. It has taken away 2 full diagonals from this bishop, and that is even better than having the pawns on the dark squares. Why is that better? Well, number 1, the bishop has limited mobility, as I'm pointing out, and number 2, now this g-pawn sitting here on g3 can never be defended by the bishop, right? By putting these pawns on light squares, Fabi has given both sides a weakness, h5, which could potentially be attacked by the bishop on this diagonal, and g3, which can definitely be attacked by the knight at a later date, but can never be defended by the bishop. And quite obviously, to my eyes, g3 is a bigger weakness than h5, which is why practically I would rather have the black pieces here. Objectively, I think this position is level. I think the game is still equal, but practically, I think it is easier to play for black because Fabi has cemented this weakness on g3 and sort of lessened the severity of his own weakness on h5. This is not going to be an easy pawn to attack for Aryan Tari at all. So, what should have white done? What should white have done? I think h takes g5 is actually a good move for white. Black does have these ideas of creating a passed pawn, but I think after bishop f3, if you go h4, king g2, and these pawns might be more weak than they are useful. I think white is going to be able to mobilize on the king side with this king especially able to stop these pawns and sort of play against these pawns more than they actually help black. So maybe g4 would be played anyways, and then we would get a very similar position, but one in which the f6 pawn has been traded for the h4 pawn. Is this favorable for white? I actually do think so, because it takes away black's final idea of playing f5. With all that in mind, though, that's not what we saw in the game. Instead, we see this position appear. So now if you're Fabiano Caruana, you have successfully prevented white from his b3, b4 idea. That doesn't mean you can really forget about it, though. You should definitely, always be aware that this possibility exists. You have improved your position on the king side by cementing this pawn on g3 and g4. Now, how do you go about actually winning the game? Well, of course, we still have this idea of f5 that we talked about earlier. f5 to change the position and get at the weaknesses in white's camp. So, how do we prepare f5, or is it prepared enough? Are we ready to do it? What do you guys think? What do we think? What should black do here? Just f5 immediately, says Bobbert. Aryan says needs more preparation. Harry Gates thinks we could improve black's king. Rook f8 is being suggested. Rook c5 has been suggested. b6 first. King f7, king g6. So there are a lot of good ideas and some not so good ideas, to be honest with you. I think that the best thing that black can do here is what Fabi does in the game, which is rook c5. Adding some pressure to this pawn, rook 4 to c5, by the way. If you go rook 8 to c5, you're sort of asking for some trouble with this rook getting trapped on this square. But yeah, rook 4 to c5, and the point is we are applying some pressure to this pawn. Why does this matter? Well, you will see a little bit later on. Stay tuned. As for improving the king, we're not really interested in getting our king to f5. It's more about getting the king to f6, allowing some other piece to capture on f5, like the knight. So we can get at this pawn on g3, get at this rook on e3, and have our king play a more defensive role defending this pawn on f6. So I think the king is well placed already, ready to step to f6 after the move f5 appears on the board. As for b6, I think, yeah, this isn't a bad move by any means. It's definitely a slight improvement to black's position, rather. But I just don't think it's the most useful improvement of all time. I think rook c5 is a bit better. White actually plays the move bishop f1 here, keeping an eye on b5, because believe it or not, if white plays some nonchalant move, maybe black was considering to play b5 himself, opening up some more files on the queen side. Not definitely, but maybe it's an idea to think about. And after bishop f1, we do actually see the move f5 come on the board for Fabi. Aryan Tari responds by capturing. If you don't take this pawn, then probably black is going to do the capturing for you, or at the very least consider coming to f4 with some very scary looking pawns on the king side. So takes was played in the game, and now rook takes d5 is Fabi's idea, with the pressure on this pawn becoming very, very relevant. And now Aryan, unfortunately, is losing the thread in the position. He plays the move rook d3, which is sort of the beginning of the end. Rook d3 is the wrong idea for white. I will tell you. So what is the right idea for white? Let's see if we can hold this position against Fabiano Caruana, chat room. What do you guys think? How can white still save this game without really even being worse at all? And then, yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about rook 4 to c5. Apparently I did not do the best job explaining there. So yeah, Bobbert has the right idea again. Rather than get caught up playing moves like rook d3, trying to trade pieces, white should be playing against the e5 pawn and improving his pieces. So that means rook a to e1 and bishop d3. These two moves are what white should really be thinking about here. What do these moves have in common? They are stopping the move e4 from being a good idea. Rook a to e1, e4, bishop g2, and this pawn is dying. And bishop d3 is probably even simpler, with the point being you just control this square outright. Okay, so why is this super important? Well, because in the game we see rook d3, rook c to c5, sorry, rook c to c5, not rook d to c5, rook a d1, and white gets this trade that he wanted, but now black has the critical idea of e4. And this is the idea that really gives black the most winning chances. By playing e4 sort of counterintuitively, again putting a pawn on a light square, black is effectively shutting this bishop out of the game and preparing to invade with the rook and advance his king up the board, king e6, king e5. And now black is definitely the only person playing for the advantage in this game. e4 is sort of the point of Fabi's play thus far, and this is why Aryan Tari would have been better served putting the rooks in the e-file, putting the bishop on d3 earlier, and playing against this idea of e4. So why is rook 4 to c5 so good here? Well, number one, it's pressuring the d5 pawn, and number two, really is this subtle idea of b5. This is why Aryan Tari routes this bishop back to f1 to keep an eye on the b5 square. Because this idea of b5 is sort of a little bit scary for white to have to meet, with stuff like knight c4 coming as well, and all of white's queenside pawns falling under a little bit of pressure. So that's why rook 4 c5, right? You want to pressure d5 and hint at some ideas of b5, and it induced a slightly weakening move by Aryan Tari to play against it in the form of bishop f1. Yeah, and this is mainly the point here. pressure on this pawn, and some ideas of b5. So in the game, we see this position occur, bishop e2, and now the simple move, knight takes f5, and Fabi is already sort of just winning. Notably, white could have tried to hold on with the move bishop c2, allowing rook takes with check. And now the game is going to be a bit harder for Fabi to win because of reasons. Why is that? Well, this king is defending the pawn on g3. This knight is not yet really into the game, and white still has some ideas of pressuring this e-pawn a little bit. It's just less easy for black to advance. Let's see what happened in the game, though. Bishop e2, and now the point is, if you play some simple move like rook e1, e3 check is coming, king g2, rook d5, and black has just fully taken over at this point. So in the game, Aryan switches with his bishop now to the b5 square, and Fabi just comes back to knight d6, attacking this bishop again. The bishop comes back to e2. Of course, Fabi is not going to go for a draw here, and starts advancing the king. Rook c1 was played, now king e5, rook back to d1, and now Fabi just continues improving his pieces. He plays rook c7, king g2. We finally get this b6 move that the chat wanted so badly. And again, while this is an improving move, it isn't really a move that you play unless you have nothing else to do, right? Defending the a5 pawn isn't high on your priority list. And here, while Fabi does have other things to do, the point is Aryan is repeating moves. He has nothing better to do, so Fabi can take his time here and insert a move like b6. Bishop a6 is Aryan's way of passing now. Rook f7, bishop back to e2, rook f8, rook b1. Now knight f5, again with threats, and b4 by white is finally Aryan playing for some counterplay, but knight e3 check comes, knight back to d5, and everything now is sort of just falling for white. The rook comes over to c8, and the pawn on c3 is indefensible, so we see takes in c4. Now the knight hops in to b4. Rook b1, the black king invades, and yeah, I mean, the game is just over. The game is just over here. We see Fabi go for this winning rook endgame when it is one passed pawn against 0, and Aryan Tari resigned this position. So I kind of skipped through once black was just winning there. The key point in this game is this sort of battle ideas that we get from this position onwards, right? We see white hinting at an idea of c3, b4. Fabi immediately shuts it down with the doubled rooks on the c-file. Fabi improves his position with g5, g4, and then the winning position comes after the complications of f5. Aryan just did not respond correctly, and then Fabi was able to win from here on out. Why is this position so good? Well, it's because white is sort of powerless to play against this pawn from this position. The white king is not going to be participating in the game, while the black king is. And then as we saw in the game, it's just very, very easy for black to invade using the rook. In the game, Fabi brought it to the f-file first, and then eventually invaded on the c-file / d-file, as we saw. Just improving the pieces, playing simple moves while Aryan passes, because he has nothing to do. And then after b4, we see Fabi end up on the better side of the complications, right? Knight d3 and invasions. And that's the game. So questions on this endgame. Questions especially on that battle of ideas that happened a little bit earlier on. Any questions before we continue? But yeah, I think that is all of Aryan Tari's losses so far in the tournament, so apologies to him. But like I said, he loses in interesting ways, so I thought those games were all worth going over. b2 to b4 earlier. I'm going to take a quick look at b2 to b4 earlier. Well, I guess the question is when, right? If you try to play it anywhere here, then your c-pawn just hangs, right? Fabi was sort of always keeping an eye on this idea. Right, I guess the first possible moment you could play it is here. You could play b4, but yeah, likely it would just be similar to what we saw in the game, and actually there's even simpler here with rook a7. b5 is playable, but now this bishop is sort of entombed, right? Can just switch sides again, and black is just winning. It just doesn't come with a threat, right? And then Aryan actually did play it quite quickly, but pressure on the c-pawn was enough for Fabi. Okay, let us move on. Up next, I wanted to feature a game from Alireza Firouzja, who is actually having a very decent tournament. I think after today, he has a half point above level. Of course, Norway does this funny scoring system where you can gain like 3 points for a win, you get 1 point for a draw, and you get 1.5 points for drawing and then winning an Armageddon game. And I think, you know, with all of those rules, after 3 rounds, Alireza Firouzja somehow is like 5.5 out of 10, although that math doesn't even add up. I don't know how a scoring system works. But Alireza Firouzja with a technically positive score, I believe, after 3 rounds. So let's take a look at his game against Jan-Krzysztof, something like that, Jan Duda. The game was a Caro-Kann, which we can briefly appreciate before fast-forwarding to the endgame. Shout out to Firouzja playing the Caro, and playing it well, by the way. I know this line pretty well, and yeah, this move c5 is not the most common here, but it is apparently playable. This move bishop e3, by the way, I know I'm not supposed to talk about this stuff. This is probably a little bit wrong, just a little bit slow, allowing black to liquidate some things. White captured a pawn early on over here on the b file. We saw knight d5, and you know, black takes in the center. Black has some pressure over here in exchange for his pawn, and with this pressure, we saw a queen trade, and after the move a5, the threat of a4 and capturing on b2 in some manner was too great. So we see white exchange this rook for this knight over here on the c4 square. And this is the endgame that I want to talk about. So let's pause briefly here and talk about what exactly this material imbalance is and how the game is going to continue. So, of course, first and foremost, black is up the exchange. We just saw white capture on c4 and black capture back due to these threats appearing on the b2 pawn. So to eliminate those threats, white gives up his rook for a knight, right? White, in exchange, for the moment, has 1 pawn. But, of course, the story is not quite that simple, because white has 3 pawns on the queen's side against black's 1, and black has 4 pawns on the king's side against white's 3. And actually, in a couple more moves, we see white go bishop d2, rook b5, and take on a5, take on h5. So now the story is even more complicated, with a strange 4v2 on the king's side and a 3v0 on the queen's side. So what do you guys think about this endgame? Is black better because rooks are good and knights are bad? Is white actually doing okay because these 3 pawns have nothing in their way to stop them from victory? What should be going on here? Chess King likes black. He prescribes to the methodology of the rook being worth 5 points and knights being worth 3 points, perhaps. Not a bad methodology at all. Bobbert likes black. Peter Peterson likes white. George offers no definitive opinion, but he does say that white is more mobile. Maddie says equal. Maddie, rather. I don't know. I can't say names. And yeah, the truth of the matter is nobody's really sure what's going on in this endgame, the engine included. If you ask the computer, it'll give you some score like -1, -1.5, but that's the score that it gives when it sees that black is up in exchange and isn't really sure what's going on, right? At a certain point in these endgames, when you ask the computer the evaluation and it gives you like -1, that means I have no idea what's going on. Rook is worth 5, knight is worth 3, white has a pawn for it, +1 for black, right? And so maybe I think that this endgame should, with really, really good play, end up in a draw. Why do I think that? Well, because if white plays very accurately on the defensive side of things, white might be able to actually stop these 4 pawns on the king side for Firouzja. And that means that black is then going to have to switch to a defensive role, stopping the 3 pawns on the queen side of the board. Now, is black ever going to lose this endgame? Probably not. The rooks are good enough that the 3 pawns on the queen side shouldn't really create too much of a substantial threat with good play. Of course, practically, you know, if I had either side in this position, I would lose instantly against a player like Firouzja or Duda, but that's not what's at stake here, right? In the game, Duda starts with the move Rook G1, which is a pretty interesting move. I definitely think this is not what would come to mind for most people at first thought, moving the rook from C1 to G1. So what is the point? Well, the point is Duda is anticipating that Firouzja is going to try to make a passed pawn on the king side. How's Firouzja going to try to make that passed pawn? Well, it seems like the easiest way might not be by playing something like f5, e5, e4. In these endgames, the passed pawn that's the most valuable is usually the one that's on the side of the board, the one that's away from white's king, that's actually away from white's knight. That's the pawn that's going to be most difficult to stop. So Duda is likely anticipating moves like g5, h5, g4, and going for this move h3. So all the way from here, Duda is perhaps thinking about, you know, having to defend this g pawn, and also potentially having to capture on the h3 square. In addition to that, this move does a very nice thing, which is vacate the c1 square. And the c1 square is going to be useful for the knight to reroute either to e2 or out to d3. So rook g1, that's sort of the story behind this move. Black now actually starts with the move rook b5, which makes a ton of sense. He needs to get out of the way of these pawns in order to push them. White plays the move bishop d2, sort of solidifying his pieces here. This bishop was a bit loose on a5 under pressure. And now, of course, the time is right for Firouzja to push. When you're playing these positions with pawns on both sides of the board, you sort of want to be pushing as fast as possible. It is very much going to be a race between whose pawns can get there first, and so Firouzja gets a head start in this case by pushing the pawn to h5. White now is forced to spend a couple tempi solidifying his position, because right now, of course, it's difficult to push these pawns when the b2 pawn is under so much pressure and this knight is also in the way. That's why we see c3 by white. Alireza has no reason not to push. King c2 by white, again solidifying, unpinning. And Alireza again has no reason not to push. And now knight c1, getting out of the way of the pawns and again preparing to reroute the knight to the king side. Now I would like to ask you guys in the chat room, what do you think the best continuation is here for Firouzja? Obviously, we want to make a passed pawn somehow on the king side of the board, but the specifics of that can get rather messy. So what's the best way to continue now for Firouzja? So there are two competing ideas in the chat room already. One is g3, and one is g takes f. Okay, h4 has also been suggested, which is a, sort of sacrifice of the pawn. Not a real sacrifice, because the pawn is defended, but in a sense, it is sacrificial in nature. A lot of people say g3. And Olniak says he believes he played g3, but he's not sure why. And yeah, g3 is the move played in the game. And this is a pretty interesting one. I don't actually think g3 was quite correct, because white was able to set up a very, sort of unique, interesting type of fortress. I think the best move in this case is to immediately create a passed pawn, which you can do, in fact, by playing g takes f. What's the downside? Well, the downside is you lose some time by getting checked. You have to put the king in a slightly awkward square, like h7. The upside is that there are 0 things standing in between this pawn and becoming a queen on h1. It is a passed pawn through and through. And with that, I think black has very, very good winning chances here. For example, if something like f4, trying to interfere with the pieces here, we can push to h4 without concern. Knight d3. Now this rook is sort of in danger of getting trapped, so rook a4 hits this guy. a3, rook h5. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. And just for example here, something like knight f2. And the story is very much going to be about this pawn on h4. Can we push to h3? Maybe that's a bit premature because this guy could be falling. But I think we can just sort of reroute with something like rook h8. White should try to blockade. And something like rook g8 I think is even perfectly fine here for black. Although maybe rook g8 is not the best. These positions are always incredibly complicated. The point is, black has a passed pawn on h4. Is it enough to objectively win the game against perfect play? I don't know, but it is a passed pawn nonetheless. In addition to that, black is going to have ideas of playing e5 a little bit later on, creating a second passed pawn for himself as well. And I think this would have offered maybe better winning chances than what Firouzja got in the game. That being said, Firouzja did in fact win the game, so let's go back to what he played. There is a third option in the position, by the way, which is something that I think Bobbert was mentioning, which is, not doing anything with this pawn, and just playing something like king f8. And I think this isn't bad, but I do think it is a bit slow. Moves like b3 can come, and something like fg4 after this rook moves, and you might have a hard time creating passed pawn after fg, hg appears on the board. Same thing with h4. I think here the move b3 is the reason why this isn't going to be so good, because then f takes g4 is an actual pawn sacrifice for the moment. In the game, though, we see g3, which is a very interesting change in position. Now, of course, the idea is still h4, h3, but the difference is now the g pawn is going to become passed and not the h pawn there, because of course g takes h is always going to be playable for white. So how does white respond to this? Well, he starts by pushing his own pawns, which is very, very reasonable. b3, rook c8, Duda goes a4, rook f5 is Firouzja's choice. Now knight e2 hits this pawn on g3, so h4 appears, and now we see c4 by Duda. And, it's sort of a warning to black here. It's like, yeah, great job pushing your h and g pawns, but be careful, buddy. I have 3 connected passers on the queen side of the board. Best of luck to you. So, now if you are Firouzja, you need to find some way to continue this game, right? For the moment, your g and h pawns are sort of locked down. There's no way to advance those guys any further. So how do you continue the game here? What's the plan for black? If black captures, white doesn't have to capture. White kind of has to capture that pawn on f3. Otherwise, that pawn is going to be a bit strong. Danilo wants to reroute the rooks to the h and g files, and that's a pretty interesting idea. I don't think it's going to be the best idea in this case. Why not? Well, if you completely abandon the queen side and just sort of go rook h5, king h7, rook g8, these guys might start pushing. They might start pushing up the board, right? So I think, black has a pretty good defensive setup, actually, against these pawns. b4 is hard to play without hanging the c4 pawn. a5 might be playable, but it's going to be a bit lonely there without, b4 being playable. c5, of course, is being well prevented for the moment, so I sort of like how black has his position set up over here. I think the way to continue is an idea that nobody has actually mentioned yet. I don't think it's rook d8, bishop d4. Again, I like where these rooks are, preventing b4 for the moment, kind of preventing a5 with ideas of bishop d8 when b4, again, is unplayable. I think the idea is to break down this guy on f3. And that's why Firouzja plays the move e5. And I sort of like this for black in a practical sense. The idea is to go e4 and just either get the rook in the game or take on f3 and be sort of crushing. White goes bishop e3 in this case, maybe preparing something like c5. And we see bishop g5 now by black, taking away the dark squared bishop for white, which was doing a nice offensive job preparing c5 and a nice defensive job as well, guarding these important squares. So bishop g5, rook g5 played in the game. Rook h1 is how Duda is getting counterplay against the h-pawn, and now we see rook h5, king c3. So white is slowly but surely preparing to advance up the board over here, but now with the position simplified a little bit, the way is sort of clear for f5, right? Duda did a great job of playing against the immediate e4 by playing this bishop e3 idea, but now black is able to sort of advance with this f-pawn. By the way, be careful here. If you play something like knight takes g3, thinking you have a very clever tactic, you might be running into rook takes g2, rook takes h4, rook f2, when at the end of the day, you might not be so happy about the pawns you captured because your rook is sort of entombed. Your rook actually is sort of entombed. Or, sorry, not your rook, your knight is sort of entombed. And you're going to have a very difficult time sort of untangling in this position. So, no knight takes g3 played by Duda. Instead, b4, which I think is along the right track, just strictly going for counterplay by pushing these pawns on the queen side. Now, f4 by Firouzja takes away even this option of capturing on g3. a5 now by white is actually the losing move. So, white to play and draw this position. What do you guys think? White to play and draw. I will be very impressed if anybody can come up with a move. Very, very impressed if you guys can come up with white to play and draw here. Michael Harmon says b5. Knight b1 has been suggested, which is not a legal move, but then this is amended to say knight g1. And yeah, the answer here, I think the simplest way to draw is actually the very counterintuitive knight g1, putting the knight and the rook on the starting squares. You know, of course, what else? Preparing for the next game, as Ben Feingold would say. What's the point? And the point is that these are the two squares that black absolutely must pass through if he is going to create a passed pawn. And with the knight on g1, black can't break through. You just cannot break through these two squares, no matter how hard you try. If you play something like e4, it will be captured. And the idea here is not to play knight f3 or knight h3, it's to leave the knight on g1 and say, yeah, you are not going to break through this light squared blockade that I have created. You can go something like rook e5, not rook f5, but rook e5. You'll be met by king d4, not king d3, but king d4. If you step back, now that you've released the tension on h3, knight f3 can be played, and once again, white has successfully blockaded these kingside pawns. And this was the idea that was missed by Jan Duda. Apparently, b5 is also potentially playable, but I really don't understand why, to be honest with you. Maybe we can compare this with what happened in the game and arrive at some sort of conclusion. Apparently, h3 is the idea. Rook h3, gh3, and then yeah, if e4, yeah, maybe this is still losing, knight g1 here. Yeah, I have no idea why this is different than the game, to be honest, why a5 and b5 have meaningful differences. Let's take a look at what happened in the game and find out. So a5 played in the game, and then as I sort of spoiled, the idea is h3 here, breaking through now and creating passed pawns. G takes h3, and now e4, and these pawns are sort of unstoppable. No time for knight takes f4, by the way, not actually because of ef3, when white can actually capture this guy because this move is check, but rather because of the move rook f5, right? The knight moves away, and we capture here, and now black gets the same stuff, but without losing a rook. Alternatively, you know, of course, white is perfectly, you know, allowed to go for this position with one full rook down, but being down one full rook is going to be tough, even with 4 pawns to compensate here. In the game after e4, f takes e4 was played, and I think this is, you know, sort of the dead lost move. Rook f1 was actually playable when after g2, rook f2, e takes f3. Knight g1 is still some sort of blockade, obviously a worse blockade than the one that we had earlier, but this might keep the game going. Fortunately, rook e5, rook e3 is going to be pretty powerful for black. But that's not what we see in the game. In the game, we saw f takes e4, and now g2 takes with check, f3, and the game ended pretty shortly here after f2, when Jan went ahead and resigned. So what's the big deal, though? There's still this mystery, which I didn't even realize. I thought knight g1 was like the drawing move. Apparently b5 is okay. So what's the difference here? Why does rook takes h3 lose in this case? Wow. Apparently rook a8 is the only move to win the game here. This is one that's beyond me, my friends. This is one that's beyond me. The same idea is drawing for the same reasons of knight g1 as b5. But yeah, apparently you go rook a8 and you win the game. Yeah, that's a bit of a stunner to me. I guess the idea is that after a5, rook a8, these pawns are actually impossible to move, right? If you had the pawn on b5 and rook a8 was played, king b4 could be played, but now these pawns just cannot move. And so white is welcome to bring his king back to the king's side, but now black is able to activate his own king here. And if something like c5, trying to advance the pawns, looks like just king f7, king c4, king e6, king b5, and now it's too little too late, apparently. That's a bit of a stunner to me. So apparently, if white had played b5, this position is drawing because king b4 is playable after rook a8, with stuff like c5, and these pawns are actually useful for white. Did not realize that was a drawing idea when I prepped this lecture. I thought this idea of knight g1 was sort of the only way to play, but apparently this is tactically okay for white as well. Although even better than king b4 is b6 here, when you can't take this because of b7. So, wow, stunning idea there that I did not realize while I was doing the lecture prep. So this was a very, very complicated endgame. But do you guys have questions on how this was played and why black ended up winning? Any questions on this one? Obviously, this one is rather complicated, but at its core, the ideas for black the ideas were, number one, position the rooks so that these queenside pawns can't advance too rapidly, and number two, just clown push on the king's side and try to create some kind of passed pawn over there. At the end of the game, Firouzja does end up winning thanks to this idea, but Duda did have his counter chances to draw. What's the valuation of this position? So if you ask the engine, it says -1 here, which means it doesn't know. It sees that black is up in exchange for a pawn and spits out -1. Looking at the game more, I think it's possible that it's winning for black, but I think it's maybe even more likely that white can draw this with hyper-accurate play. Practically, though, it's going to be a difficult game for white, to be sure. Okay. If there are no questions on this one, I think I have time to very, very briefly show you guys one more endgame. We only have 10 minutes left in the lecture, so it's more just going to be of exposing you guys to the game rather than going in-depth into the ideas. But let's take a look. All right, and our last game is again going to be a game of Dudas. And much like Aryan Tari, he is having a pretty tough tournament, but he keeps losing in interesting ways. So let's see how his game actually goes here against Aronian. So, don't care about any of this. That's not an endgame. Oh wait, we arrived at the endgame rather quickly. Of course, Duda playing a pretty quiet line here, going for an early queen trade. And then we see some pieces coming off the board. Bishop f4, king f4, rook a8, bishop b6, and f e6. So, you might be looking at this game, and you might be saying, this is the most boring game of chess I have ever seen in my life. They traded off all the pieces besides the rooks, the pieces most well known for, drawing every endgame that they are ever in, and then they played this position. But plenty of things to take away from this endgame. This is sort of chess at its most base level, at its most pure. There are only 2 rooks for either side. There's one imbalance in the position, and it looks to be unfavorable for black. So how on earth does Levon Aronian end up winning this game? Well, let me show you guys. Duda starts with rook e2. We see rook d4 check, king g3, rook h d8, taking over the open file. In the meantime, Duda goes for rook a to e1. Now, I should say, if all Duda wanted was a draw, rook a to d1 is the way to do it. Now, black is never taking over the open file. So Duda is actually playing for more with rook e2 and rook a to e1, playing for pressure against the e-pawn, but allowing black some control over the d-file. Levon Aronian controls the e-pawn like this, and white goes f4. A pretty natural idea, actually, to control the e5 square and make sure that the e-pawn stays firmly put. The game continues with king f6, king f3, both sides improving their kings, and we see now Aronian play h5. And I think this is the first really instructive move that Levon plays. The point is, white can now never play g4, and after white solidifies his position with g3, as we'll see, a great way to play against the structure of the pawns, by the way, a couple more moves being played here, is to have the idea of h4 in your back pocket. This is a fantastic way for Levon to play against these sort of three pawns in a nice little chain here by playing h4. When g takes h would fracture the structure, g4 would weaken this pawn on f4, and ignoring it may allow this pawn to step to h3 when it is dangerously close to queening and introduces all sorts of tactics for black. So now obviously h4 is not going to immediately be played, but Levon has this idea in his back pocket here, and it's a good one at that. g6 played first. We see rook e5, b6, b3, c5, c4, and now instructive idea number 2. We saw Levon go for some ideas of this on the king's side, and now even in the symmetrical position, notably, this pawn on b6 is about as safe as it can get, whereas this pawn on b3 is not as safe. It's a little bit more open with black having access to it along this open file. So Levon plays a5 and sort of dares Duda to go for a symmetrical structure over here when access to this b3 pawn may become very, very important. King f2 played instead. The players do, Levon goes rook d3, further introducing ideas now of a4 and preventing white from playing a4. Duda takes back control of this third rank, and Levon trades off one set of rooks. We see a check and rook d1. Duda goes king f3, and at this point, Levon plays the interesting move, pawn to a4. And this is how Levon really starts to make something out of nothing here. His weakness on e6 is sort of never really going to be felt anymore, with only one rook on the board, and the black king well placed to defend it. And now he is inciting weaknesses in the white camp here. Duda tried b takes a4, but now after rook c1, white is quite simply unable to defend all of his pawns. We see rook e3 played in the game, rook takes c4, rook a3, king f5 now, advancing the pawns. And Duda's idea was not a bad one. His idea was to play a5 here to get rid of this b pawn for this a pawn. b5 would be ill-advised when this pawn runs very, very fast, so b takes a5, rook takes a5 is played. Now, is black winning this endgame? Absolutely not. Is black better in this endgame? Practically, I would say definitely yes. Why is that? Well, for one, his pawn is slightly more advanced, and secondly, his king is much better placed than his opponent's king. By virtue of having this pawn on e6 rather than f5, his king was able to occupy the f5 square, and now after rook c3 check, king e2, Levon has a very nice idea to firmly seize the advantage in this endgame. So, what you guys got for me here? Black to move with a very interesting idea to seize the advantage. Rook d3 seems strange. Why not rook b2? I'll take a look at that at the very end. But we are sort of rushing here. Just wanted to show you guys this last game while we had the time. And yeah, the chat room is on it tonight. This idea of h4 finally comes into play. Breaking down this f4 pawn. And by the way, don't even think about ignoring it with something like a4. Although maybe you can think about ignoring it, but these ideas are still going to be in the position, as well as some ideas of doing this, and going for a good old-fashioned 2v1 endgame, even if it is technically drawn. Okay, in the game though, Duda actually captures again, and in this case, I think this gives black some more practical tries, because now the king is able to invade on f4. King d2 played in the game, now rook h3, we do see this pawn fall off the board, but we see rook takes h2, and now e5. Notably, Levon Aronian not actually capturing on a2 directly, but understanding that his advantage is this e-pawn, he's going to win by promoting this guy, and so he starts pushing him right away, when pushing this guy is sort of a lost cause. Black can always get behind this pawn. So rook c4 check was played by Duda, and this is a bit of a mistake. Inducing e4 is not really what is going to help him in this position. Black was pushing this pawn anyways. Rook back to c6 now, challenges this pawn, but king f3 is a nice winning move by Levon Aronian. What's the point? The point is this king cannot stay in front of the pawn any longer. Rook f6 check means king d6. Now king f1 is rook h1 check. The king has been evicted. Levon picks up this pawn as well. Goes king e2, and this is winning. Rook h7, by the way, is a miracle draw somehow for Duda here. Apparently rook h5 was the winning move. Why? Well, after rook h7, apparently a4 is playable. e3 means a5. And no matter how you try to push this pawn, a6 is coming, e2, now rook e6. And what's the point? The point is king d2. Well, sorry, the point is you have to play rook f7 first to cut off this king. Then after king g2, if you try to promote this pawn, there's rook d6 check, and you can't escape the checks. And if you try to build a bridge, as we've all been taught, of course, a7 is just in time for white. For rook a5, there's rook e7, and again, you are unable to build the bridge thanks to the threats of this a-pawn. For example, king to e4, rook e5, but at the end of the day, it's actually going to be white who's winning this game, thanks to a nice little tactic here with queen e8. So that was somehow a miracle draw for white that I wanted to just point out, so people didn't yell at me. Rook h5 was winning, because then that pawn can never get past a5. But this was missed in the game. Both players in a bit of, well, one player in a bit of time pressure here, Levon Aronian with over an hour on his clock versus 7 minutes. And Duda played the move rook b6 instead, which does lose to the simple push. Pretty nice idea here by Levon, going king c2, highlighting the fact that the rook could not get far enough away to give meaningful checks from the side. And now rook f7 cuts off this king, and this a-pawn is far too slow. Rook f5 is played in the game. The point is now if a5, rook takes a5 with queens. Rook a2 check played, king d3, rook a1, king e3, check, king e4, rook a1, and then the final move of the game is the nice rook d5 with rook d1 to follow, sort of unstoppable promotion of the pawn. Rook e1 means king e3, and again, rook d1 will be coming. So a nice game by Levon Aronian, winning from a seemingly dead equal position. The key points I want to highlight are this a4 and h4 breaks. Now there was a quick question, why rook e3, why not rook b2? To be honest with you, rook b2 was probably just a better move. I'm not sure why rook e3 was played. Maybe Duda had some idea in mind that I wasn't thinking of. But one notable fact is that after this variation, the a2 pawn would be attacked, whereas in the variation played in the game, the rook is already on a5 defending this guy. But to be honest, it doesn't make too much of a difference in the game. The key mistake here, I think, was allowing this king to get to f3 like this. I think rook c4 check in particular is also pretty wrong. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me here tonight. I know we didn't spend a lot of time on that last endgame, but I thought it was worth showing with these neat little h4, a4 pushes on both sides of the board that Levon Aronian pulled out to win a nice endgame against Jan Duda. Hopefully you enjoyed tonight's lecture on all these various endgames from Norway Chess. I think this is a really interesting tournament so far. It's been a lot of fun to follow. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it as well. If you're watching live, the fun is going to continue on our Twitch channel with Analyze Your Games. If you're watching the YouTube version, that's it from me tonight. Again, thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.